My name is Hannah. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the dependable one. The woman who shows up early, leaves late, and keeps her voice steady even when everything inside feels anything but. I work in a role where precision matters and mistakes are expensive, and that has shaped how people see me. Calm, capable, efficient. Some would say forgettable. Others would say reliable. I used to believe those were the same thing. People often underestimate me because I don't express my emotions. I don't raise my voice. I don't dramatize my pain. I've learned how to be composed in rooms where urgency is rewarded and vulnerability is quietly penalized. From the outside, my life looked ordered and successful. Inside, it was narrower than anyone realized. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about a moment that didn't look like a moment at all. Just a phone vibrating on a desk, a name lighting up a screen, and a choice I told myself I'd fix later. I missed my sister's call. Because of work. She never called again. That sentence still feels unreal when I say it out loud. The truth underneath it is even quieter. I answered emails instead. I regret that every day. What follows is not a tragedy in the way movies like to tell them. There's no single villain, no explosive argument, no dramatic goodbye. It's a slow human story about priorities, silence, and how being the responsible one can sometimes become a way of disappearing from your own life. It's about how we teach people what they can take from us, and how long it can take to notice the cost. I'm telling this story because I believe in emotional justice. Not the loud kind, but the honest kind. The kind that comes from looking directly at your own choices without flinching. There are moments in this story where I failed. There are moments when I stayed quiet when it would have been easier to speak. And there are moments where silence becomes something else entirely. If you stay with me, you won't hear a tale of perfect wisdom or dramatic redemption. You'll hear a reflection on how one ordinary decision can echo for years, and how power sometimes shows up not as control over others, but as clarity about yourself. So before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently, and without judgment, have you ever assumed there would be more time? For a long time, I knew exactly who I was to people. I was the reliable one, the safe one, the one you could lean on without worrying that I'd lean back too hard. At work, I was described as solid. Not brilliant, not flashy. Solid. The kind of person who gets things done without needing applause. I was trusted with complex projects, quiet cleanups, and uncomfortable conversations that needed to be handled without drama. When something went wrong, my name was mentioned in the same sentence as the solution. When something went right, my name rarely came up at all. I told myself that was fine, even noble. In my family, the role was similar, just dressed in warmer language. I was the responsible sister, the one who didn't need checking on, the one who had her life together. My younger sister, Lily, was the emotional center of the family, expressive, sensitive, the one whose moods set the temperature in every room. I learned early that my steadiness made space for her volatility, and so I stayed steady. No one ever said, "Hannah can handle it," but they didn't have to. Their behavior said it for them. They called Lily when something felt urgent. They updated me later. They worried about Lily burning out. They assumed I was already managing. When I visited home, I helped without being asked. I listened more than I spoke. I remembered birthdays, paid attention to details, and smoothed over awkwardness. If something needed doing quietly, it found its way to me. And I didn't resent it. That's the part people misunderstand. Invisibility isn't always painful when it's familiar. Sometimes it feels like peace. I wore my role like a well-fitted coat. It kept me warm. It also kept people from noticing what was underneath. What most people didn't see was how carefully curated my calm was. How much effort did it take to always be the one who didn't need anything? I had trained myself out of interruption, out of urgency, out of asking twice. I believed, truly believed, that if something mattered enough, it would eventually make its way back to me. Lily used to tease me about it. "You're like a lighthouse," she once said. "You're just there, steady, watching." I laughed when she said it. I took it as a compliment. But lighthouses don't move, and no one asks how they feel about the storms. To others, I was low maintenance. That label followed me everywhere. It sounded flattering, but it carried an assumption. You don't require care. And when people believe that, they stop offering it. At work, colleagues would interrupt my lunch but hesitate to interrupt someone else's. They assumed I wouldn't mind. I never corrected them. In my family, decisions were made without me because I was busy anyway. I usually was. Or at least, I made sure I looked that way. Busyness became my shield. If I were occupied, no one could accuse me of withdrawing. If I were productive, no one could ask why I was quiet. And Lily, my sister, she believed I was always there. Not physically, perhaps, but structurally. Like gravity. Like something constant. She didn't have to check. I had taught her that. We teach people who we are by what we tolerate, by what we make look easy. I made being unavailable look responsible. I made being silent look strong. I made being last look voluntary. There was no single moment where I became this version of myself. It happened in increments. In choices that felt reasonable at the time. In decisions that were rewarded just enough to keep repeating them. So when people tell this story from the outside, they often say, "No one could have known." But that's not entirely true. They knew who I was to them. And I knew who I had allowed myself to become. At least I thought I did. The first small cut never announces itself. It doesn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives quietly, disguised as something reasonable, something forgettable. That's why it works. For me, it happened on a Tuesday afternoon that looked exactly like every other Tuesday. My calendar was full in that tidy, color-coded way that made my life appear balanced. Meetings stacked cleanly, deadlines spaced just enough to breathe. I remember feeling proud of that, how controlled it all looked. My phone buzzed while I was in the middle of responding to an email thread that had already gone on too long. I glanced down, expecting a calendar alert or a reminder. It was Lily. I remember the precise flicker of thought that crossed my mind. I'll call her back in 10 minutes. That thought felt kind, responsible, adult. The email I was answering wasn't urgent. Not truly, but it was visible. It had names attached to it. CC lines. Consequences I could measure. Lily's call had none of that. No subject line, no deadline, just her name on my screen. I silenced the phone and kept typing. That's the moment people like to dramatize. They imagine a dramatic choice between love and ambition. That isn't what it was. It was a habit choosing itself. I had missed calls before. We all do. Lily and I weren't the kind of sisters who spoke every day. We were close in a way that didn't demand constant maintenance. Or so I believed. She knew I was busy. She always said she understood. That's what made the decision feel harmless. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Then another meeting started, one I couldn't step out of without drawing attention. I told myself I'd call her after. I even wrote it on a sticky note and pressed it to the edge of my monitor like a promise. But the day didn't slow down. It never does when you rely on it to justify things. By the time I left the office, it was dark. The sticky note was still there, curled slightly at the corner. I saw it as I shut down my computer. I remember thinking, tomorrow morning, I'll call her first thing. I didn't notice what that thought was doing. It was teaching me that delay had no cost. The next morning came with its own urgency. A message from my manager. A sudden issue that needed smoothing. Coffee gone cold on my desk. The sticky note came off, folded once and slipped into my planner. Out of sight. Not forgotten, just postponed again. Lily didn't call back. That was unusual, but not alarming. She was expressive, but also sensitive. If I missed her call, she might wait for me to return it rather than call again. I assumed she was giving me space. That assumption sat comfortably next to everything else I assumed about her. I texted her that afternoon. Something light. Casual. Hey, sorry I missed your call yesterday. Busy day. How are you? I didn't mention the word busy as an excuse. It was a reflex. The message showed as delivered. No response. That's when the cut deepened, just slightly. Enough to register, but not enough to stop me. I told myself she was probably at work, or with friends, or just not in the mood to text. I told myself not to overthink it. Overthinking was something other people did. Days passed, then a week. When I finally called her, it went to voicemail. I left a message that sounded like me. Calm, upbeat, unconcerned. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't say I was worried. I said I hoped she was well. I see now how careful that message was. How it protected me from sounding needy. How it maintained the version of myself everyone expected. No one around me noticed anything had shifted. At work, I was praised for handling a difficult situation with grace. At home, nothing seemed urgent enough to interrupt the rhythm of my competence. And that's the quiet danger of the first small cut. It doesn't bleed where anyone can see it. It just changes how something fits inside you. I didn't know it then, but that missed call wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern revealing itself. After that missed call, nothing dramatic happened. That's important to say, because we're conditioned to look for explosions, arguments, accusations, confrontations that justify hindsight. But life rarely offers that kind of clarity. What it offers instead is repetition. And repetition has a way of quietly teaching you what to accept. Lily's silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like distance. And distance was something I knew how to rationalize. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was sensitive and needed space. I told myself she knew I cared, even if I wasn't always available. I had so many explanations ready that I didn't notice how little evidence I had for any of them. When I think back now, what unsettles me most is how quickly I adjusted. I sent fewer messages. Not because I didn't want to bother her, but because I didn't want to confront the possibility that she might not respond. Each unanswered text trained me to lower my expectations. Each delay became proof that this was just how things were now, and I let that become normal. At work, my unavailability to myself was being rewarded. I was given more responsibility, more trust, and more projects that required someone who wouldn't panic or push back. I became the person others relied on to absorb pressure without complaint. That identity felt earned. It also felt safer than asking for anything in return. The strange thing is, no one explicitly disrespected me. They just didn't notice me stepping back. Meetings were scheduled over my lunch breaks because I was flexible. Decisions were finalized without my input because I would be fine with it. When I did speak up, people listened, but they didn't wait for me. That's how normalization works. It's not that people treat you badly. It's that they stop checking whether you're still there. In my family, the shift was subtler. Lily stopped sharing small things. The passing thoughts, the half-formed worries, the casual updates that had once filled our conversations. When she did reach out, it was usually in response to something I initiated, and the replies were shorter, polite, contained. I told myself she was growing, that we were both adults now, that closeness didn't have to look the same forever. Those explanations were comforting. They also absolved me of having to ask a harder question. Had I taught her that my attention was conditional? There were moments, small, quiet ones, where I felt the weight of what was happening. A photo she posted that I hadn't heard about. A family conversation where someone mentioned Lily had been going through a lot, and no one elaborated. I noticed these things. I registered them. Then I filed them away under things I'll address later. Later became my favorite word. Later allowed me to stay functional. It allowed me to keep being the person everyone depended on. It also allowed me to ignore the growing sense that I was being left out of my own relationships. What I didn't recognize at the time was that this wasn't just something being done to me. I was participating. Every time I chose not to follow up. Every time I softened my concern into neutrality. Every time I prioritized being easy over being present. I wasn't being mistreated in obvious ways. I was being slowly deprioritized, and I was making it look acceptable. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption. The assumption that you'll adapt, that you won't mind, that you don't need the same care as everyone else. And when you don't challenge that assumption, it hardens. By the time I realized something was wrong, the pattern was already established. Lily no longer reached for me instinctively. Work no longer paused for my input. My presence had become optional, and my absence was manageable. The most unsettling part is this. No one sat me down and told me I mattered less. They didn't have to. I had already shown them what they could take, and what I would quietly give up. Roles are rarely announced. They're inferred, reinforced, and eventually accepted. By the time I became aware of mine, it was already well rehearsed. I was the one who filled the gaps, the one who absorbed overflow, the one whose reliability made other people's urgency feel optional. At work, this role came with respect, but a very specific kind. I was valued for my output, not my presence. For my availability, not my perspective. When I spoke, people nodded. When I was silent, things moved on. That should have bothered me more than it did. I had convinced myself that visibility was overrated, that influence could be exercised quietly, that being underestimated was, in some way, an advantage. There's truth in that, but only if the silence is chosen. Mine wasn't. It was expected. The role I was assigned didn't require me to be whole. It required me to be useful. I saw it clearly one afternoon when a colleague thanked me for always being so easy to work with. She meant it kindly. I smiled and said the right thing. But later, alone at my desk, I realized what that praise implied. Easy meant I didn't push back. Easy meant I didn't complicate things with needs. Easy meant I didn't ask for time, or attention, or reconsideration. At home, the role was gentler, but just as limiting. I was the sister who didn't need checking in on, the one who had it handled. When Lily struggled, the family closed ranks around her. When I struggled, I learned to do it quietly. No one told me I couldn't lean on them. They just didn't make space for it. And I didn't insist. I remember a family dinner where Lily arrived late, visibly exhausted. Everyone's focus shifted immediately. Questions, concerns, offers of help. I watched from across the table, feeling both relieved and strangely distant. When someone asked how I was doing, it was almost an afterthought. Good, I said, because that was my line, because anything else would have required explanation. That night, I realized something uncomfortable. If I ever needed to fall apart, I wouldn't know how to do it where people could see. The role I was assigned didn't include messiness. It didn't include urgency. It didn't include interruption. At work, I began to notice how often decisions were framed as already made by the time they reached me. I was brought in to execute, not to shape. When I suggested alternatives, they were acknowledged politely and then sidelined. Not dismissed, just deferred. Later. There it was again. Later. Later is the word you use when someone's input isn't essential. I had become essential to the functioning of systems, but optional in the shaping of them. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I started watching more closely, not with resentment, but with curiosity. How often was I consulted before a decision? How often after? Who was protected when things went wrong? Who absorbed the correction quietly? The pattern was consistent. Those who expressed needs were managed. Those who expressed boundaries were negotiated with. Those who expressed nothing were assumed to be fine. I had been performing fine for so long that people no longer questioned it. And Lily, my sister, had learned the same lesson, just from a different angle. She had learned that if something mattered enough, she had to reach for people who responded immediately. People who made urgency visible. I had taught her that I wasn't one of them, not because I didn't care, but because I had made caring look like something that could wait. Understanding that was the first time the role felt heavy, because roles can be adjusted when they're seen. And for the first time, I was really seeing mine. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument or a revelation. It came with a pause. I was standing in line at a grocery store after work, holding a basket that contained nothing urgent. Bread, eggs, a bottle of olive oil I didn't really need. My phone was in my coat pocket. I remember that clearly because I kept feeling it vibrate against my leg. Phantom alerts that weren't actually there. I hadn't heard from Lily in weeks. Not a text. Not a call. Not even one of her impulsive voice notes that used to arrive without warning. I had told myself, again, that it was just a phase, that adults drift, that this was normal. But standing there, watching the cashier scan items with mechanical precision, something in me finally stopped running ahead to explanations. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel fear. I felt an absence, not the dramatic kind. The kind that settles quietly once it realizes it's been ignored for too long. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided. If Lily needed me, really needed me, would she call? The answer arrived without emotion. No. And that was the shift. It wasn't anger that followed. It was clarity. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that rearranges things internally and waits for you to notice. I realized I had been confusing availability with presence. I had been telling myself that being reachable eventually was the same as being there when it mattered. That assumption had shaped my entire adult life. I paid for my groceries and walked to my car, the bags cutting into my palms. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. I remember looking at my phone, unlocked. My contact list open to Lily's name. I didn't call her, not because I didn't want to, but because I understood something new. Calling now would be about easing my discomfort, not repairing the distance. I had spent years making myself the kind of person who responded later. I couldn't undo that with a single belated gesture. That realization hurt more than I expected. It forced me to look at other parts of my life through the same lens. At work, I noticed how often I said yes before checking in with myself. How quickly I adjusted when plans changed around me. How rarely anyone asked whether the adjustment cost me anything. I had built a reputation on being unaffected, and now I was finally feeling the effects. That night, I opened my planner, the black leather one I carried everywhere. Its margins were filled with notes, tasks, and reminders for everyone but me. I flipped back through weeks of entries and saw the same pattern repeated. Other people's priorities, carefully managed. I found Lily's name written once, weeks earlier, next to the word call. It was crossed out, not because I had done it, but because the day had passed. Something about that detail stayed with me. Crossed out intentions still count as neglect. I didn't cry that night. I didn't spiral. I went to bed at my usual time and woke up the next morning to the same responsibilities. But something fundamental had changed. I stopped telling myself stories that softened the truth. The truth was this. I had trained the world to expect my silence. I had equated love with patience, responsibility with delay, and strength with self-erasure. And Lily had learned to stop reaching. That understanding didn't turn me into a different person overnight. But it did something more important. It made my silence conscious. For the first time, I wasn't just being quiet because it was easier. I was choosing to observe, to listen to what wasn't being said, to notice who filled the space when I didn't. And in that stillness, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not guilt, not shame, but resolve. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that waits. Once silence becomes conscious, it changes texture. Before, my quiet had been automatic, a default setting shaped by habit and reward. Now it was deliberate. I noticed when I held back. I noticed when I could speak and chose not to. And that awareness transformed silence from absence into presence. I stopped filling gaps. At work, this was the first place the shift became visible, though not to others. In meetings, I no longer rushed to clarify confusion that wasn't mine. When a plan was flawed but not catastrophic, I let it be discussed without my immediate intervention. I listened carefully, took notes, and said less. No one commented on it. They simply adjusted, and that adjustment was revealing. Projects moved forward with slightly more friction. Small misunderstandings took longer to resolve. My name appeared less frequently as the quiet solution. Instead of being relieved, I felt calm. As if I had set something down that I'd been carrying without realizing its weight. People mistook this change for compliance. They assumed I was still agreeable, just quieter. What they didn't see was the internal ledger I had started keeping. Not of grievances, but of patterns. Who asked for input? Who only asked for execution? Who followed up? Who assumed? Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space shows you who fills it. In my personal life, the shift was more complicated. I didn't reach out to Lily again. Not as a test, not as a punishment, but as an experiment in honesty. I wanted to know whether the relationship could move toward me without my constant initiation. Weeks passed. Nothing. That silence was different from the earlier ones. It no longer felt like neglect happening to me. It felt like information. I paid attention to how that made me feel. There was sadness, yes, but also a strange relief. I no longer had to perform closeness. I could stop pretending that distance was mutual when it wasn't. Family gatherings continued. Conversations flowed. Lily and I were polite, cordial, the kind of sisters who looked functional from the outside. Inside, I was watching, not to judge her, but to understand what I had been asking of her all along. I realized something uncomfortable. My steadiness had often required others to be the ones who reached, who escalated, who insisted. I had made emotional labor look like something that should come to me gently, or not at all. And now, without my effort, the connection stayed exactly where it was. Silence clarified that too. At work, people began making decisions without looping me in. I noticed it early, but I didn't correct it. I wanted to see how far it would go. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I needed to understand what my presence had been compensating for. The answer was quite a lot. When outcomes were less polished, no one blamed me. They simply accepted the new standard. And that told me something else. My excellence had been optional to them, not essential. That realization could have made me bitter. Instead, it made me precise. I began documenting. Not in a dramatic way. Just notes, dates, decisions I hadn't been consulted on, assumptions made in my absence. It wasn't ammunition, it was context. Silence gave me clarity, and clarity gave me leverage. Not over people, but over my own choices. For the first time, I understood that I didn't owe constant availability to earn care, that my quiet didn't have to mean consent. That restraint could be an act of self-respect rather than self-denial. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't explain myself. Explanation would have pulled me back into the role of accommodating discomfort, so I stayed quiet and watched how quickly that quiet was interpreted as weakness, which told me everything I needed to know. What they never noticed wasn't that I had gone quiet. It was what I was doing with the quiet. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared to change. I still arrived on time. I still met deadlines. I still spoke when spoken to. If anything, I seemed easier, less resistant, less involved in the small frictions that had once required my attention. That was the miscalculation. Because while my presence became lighter, my awareness became sharper. I started paying attention to systems instead of moments, to patterns instead of personalities. When something went wrong, I resisted the instinct to step in immediately. I let the sequence unfold. Who noticed first? Who corrected it? Who absorbed the consequence? The answers were consistent. At work, I began to see how often my role had been to quietly protect others from exposure. I caught mistakes early. I reframed weak arguments. I filled gaps before they became visible. Without that buffer, flaws traveled further. Not far enough to cause collapse, but far enough to leave traces. No one asked me why things felt rougher. They assumed it was circumstantial. That assumption worked in my favor. I documented processes, not as an audit, but as a map. Who approved what? Where decisions are bottlenecked? Which responsibilities were informally mine but formally unassigned? The more I observed, the clearer it became. Much of what I handled lived in the margins, expected but not acknowledged. That invisibility had protected me once. Now it protects my preparation. I didn't share these observations. I didn't hint at them. I didn't adjust my tone or my posture. I continued to be calm, measured, and unthreatening. People relax around those who don't demand attention, and relaxed people reveal more than they intend to. In my family, the same principle applied. I listened more than ever. I noticed how information moved, who heard things early, who heard them late, who was spared concern. I watched how Lily's struggles were discussed in softened language, while my stability was treated as a given. No one meant harm. That was the hardest part to accept. The pattern wasn't cruelty, it was convenient. I had become the place where concern didn't need to land. I stopped volunteering updates about my life. Not out of secrecy, but out of curiosity. I wanted to know whether anyone would ask. Sometimes they did. Often they didn't. And when they did, the questions were general, safe, and easy to answer without revealing much. So I didn't. What surprised me most during this period wasn't how little people noticed my withdrawal. It was how much they relied on the assumption that I would always be there. At work, long-term planning documents included my name without consultation. Responsibilities were assigned to me in absentia. When I pointed this out gently, it was framed as trust. "We just know you'll handle it," someone said once, smiling. I smiled back, but I wrote it down. Not because I was keeping score, but because I was learning where my boundaries had been erased without my permission. Meanwhile, my silence around Lily continued. Months passed. I thought about reaching out many times. Each time I asked myself the same question. Would this change the pattern, or simply reinforce it? The honest answer was the latter. So I waited, not with resentment, with patience. Silence has a way of accelerating truth. When you stop compensating, reality has to stand on its own. And reality, I was learning, had been leaning on me heavily. By the time people began to sense that something was different, they couldn't name what it was. They just knew outcomes felt less smooth. Those decisions took longer. That certain tasks were suddenly more visible, more effortful. They attributed it to growth, to the workload, to the usual explanations. No one attributed it to me, and that anonymity gave me freedom. I began positioning myself, not upward, not outward, but inward, clarifying what I would no longer absorb, what I would no longer smooth over, what I would no longer make easy at the expense of being seen. This wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a recalibration. I wasn't preparing to confront anyone. I was preparing to stop disappearing. And the quiet irony was this. The more invisible I appeared, the more control I had over what came next. Because when people don't notice your labor, they also don't notice when you redirect it. That was the leverage they never saw coming. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already felt it for months. That quiet certainty that something essential had been misplaced, and that I had been the one holding it together without being asked. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the traditional sense. No hidden document, no whispered confession. It was a convergence of small truths that had been visible all along, waiting for me to stop cushioning them. At work, the realization came first. I was reviewing a long-term operations plan one evening, the office nearly empty, the city outside dimmed by rain. My name appeared repeatedly throughout the document, not as a decision-maker, not as an approver, but as a constant point of execution. If something needed to be coordinated, I was listed. If something required follow-through, it came back to me. What struck me wasn't the workload. It was the asymmetry. So much depended on my presence, yet so little of it depended on my voice. If I stepped away, truly away, processes would stall. Not collapse, but strain. Deadlines would slip just enough to be noticed. Accountability would become diffuse. People would feel the absence without being able to name it. That was the leverage. Not power over anyone, power over my own participation. I had been operating as a structural support, not a visible leader. That made me replaceable in theory, but costly in practice. The system relied on my consistency while pretending it didn't. Seeing that didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me calm. In my family, the realization was harder. It arrived one afternoon when I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. Lily was on speakerphone with our mother, her voice low, careful. She talked about feeling overwhelmed, about not knowing who to lean on. My name wasn't mentioned. That omission landed heavier than any accusation could have. I stood in the hallway, unseen, and listened. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Lily wasn't avoiding me out of spite. She had simply learned, not consciously but completely, that I was not the place to bring urgency. I had trained her well. The reveal wasn't that she didn't care. It was that I had made myself optional. That truth sat with me for a long time. I didn't confront her. I didn't correct the narrative. I let it settle because I needed to understand my part in it fully before doing anything else. This was the moment where many stories turned toward confrontation. Mine didn't, because confrontation would have been premature. It would have asked others to adjust before I had finished adjusting myself. Instead, I refined. At work, I began formalizing what had been informal, clarifying roles, asking questions that sounded neutral but carried weight. Who owns this decision? Where is this documented? What happens if this timeline shifts? I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. I illuminated. And illumination has consequences. In my personal life, I stopped editing my absence to make it palatable. I no longer softened it with explanations or humor. I let the distance exist as it was. That was the hardest part, resisting the urge to reassure others that everything was fine, because it wasn't. And pretending it was had cost me more than I admitted. The private reveal wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. It showed me that my strength had been real, but misapplied. That my discipline had been admired, but exploited. That my silence had been interpreted not as depth, but as consent. Most importantly, it showed me that nothing would change unless I did something irreversible. Not dramatic, irreversible. I didn't know yet what that would look like. I only knew that returning to the way things were was no longer an option. Once you see where your leverage truly lies, you can't unsee it. And once you stop disappearing quietly, the world has to respond, even if it doesn't understand why. I closed my planner that night and set it beside my bed. For the first time, it didn't feel like a record of obligations. It felt like a boundary. Once you recognize leverage, you're faced with a choice that can't be undone. Not because it's dramatic, but because it changes how you exist in the system you're part of. For weeks after the private reveal, I did nothing visible. Outwardly, my life continued as before. Inwardly, I weighed options with a precision I had never applied to myself. I could speak up. That was the obvious path. Schedule conversations. Express how I felt. Ask to be seen differently. At work, that would have meant advocating for a redefinition of my role. In my family, it would have meant explaining my absence to Lily, naming the hurt, hoping for understanding. That option promised relief, but not resolution, because it relied on others to change first. I could also leave, resign from my position, step away from family dynamics that have grown unbalanced, start somewhere new where no one has learned to take my steadiness for granted. That option was clean. It was also evasive. It would have allowed me to avoid confronting the pattern I had helped create. The third option was quieter. I could change my participation without explanation. Do not withdraw in anger. Not confront in emotion. Simply stop offering what has never been requested with care. This option felt uncomfortable because it offered no immediate validation, no apology, no recognition. But it had one quality the others lacked. It was irreversible. Once you stop compensating, you can't go back to pretending that your labor is free. Once you redefine your presence, the old version of you becomes unavailable. Not because you've left, but because you've changed. That was the option I chose. The decision wasn't announced. It didn't happen on a particular date. It was a series of quiet refusals framed as questions. At work, I began declining tasks that fell outside my defined role. Politely, consistently. When asked why, I referenced capacity and clarity, not fairness or emotion. I want to make sure I'm focusing where I'm most effective. No one could argue with that without exposing the imbalance. In meetings, I stopped volunteering solutions unless asked directly. When decisions were made without my input, I let them stand. When outcomes suffered, I resisted the urge to rescue them. That restraint was the hardest part. I had built my identity on being the person who prevented consequences. Now I was allowing them, not maliciously, but honestly. In my family, the decision took a different form. I didn't reach out to Lily to repair what had broken. I waited to see if she would. That wasn't a test. It was an acknowledgement of reality. If our connection required my constant initiation, then it wasn't balanced. Waiting meant accepting uncertainty. It meant sitting with the possibility that nothing would change, that this distance might be permanent. I accepted that risk. This was the point of no return. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because I was no longer willing to disappear to preserve comfort. Silence at this stage wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. I aligned my actions with what I had learned, that presence without reciprocity is depletion, that reliability without respect becomes erasure, that love without boundaries turns into obligation. Once those truths settled, the decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I didn't feel empowered in a cinematic way. I felt grounded, as if I had finally placed my weight where it belonged. And that grounding began to register, not immediately, not loudly. But systems notice when a load-bearing structure shifts, even slightly. They just don't always know where the pressure is coming from. When I started moving in silence, it didn't feel strategic. It felt practical. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was simply adjusting my behavior to match reality, something I should have done years earlier. At work, the changes were subtle enough to be overlooked at first. I stopped staying late, just in case. I left when my responsibilities were complete, not when everyone else felt finished. I began asking for confirmation in writing, not because I didn't trust people, but because clarity protects everyone. When tasks were assigned vaguely, I asked for scope. When expectations were implied, I asked for timelines. These weren't confrontational questions. They were professional ones. But they had an effect. Ambiguity no longer landed on me by default. I noticed how often people tried to slide responsibilities into conversations casually, counting on my reflexive yes. When that didn't come, when it was met with a pause or a clarifying question, they adjusted their approach. Some seemed surprised. Others were slightly irritated. Most adapted without comment. That told me everything. Systems don't push back when you set boundaries. People do. And even then, only the ones who benefit from the lack of them. I didn't announce that I was changing how I worked. I let my calendar do the talking. My availability shrank. Not dramatically, but intentionally. I protected time without apologizing for it. I stopped rearranging my schedule to absorb last-minute urgency that wasn't mine. When things slipped because of it, I didn't rush to explain. I allowed the explanation to exist where it belonged, in the planning, or lack thereof. What surprised me was how quickly people stopped assuming I'd fix things. Not because they suddenly respected me more, but because I had removed the expectation. That expectation had been the real problem all along. In my personal life, moving in silence meant resisting old instincts. I didn't fill conversational gaps. I didn't over-explain my absence. I didn't soften my distance to make it easier for others. Family gatherings continued. I showed up. I was present. But I no longer performed emotional availability on demand. When conversations turned toward Lily, I listened without inserting myself. When concern was expressed, I didn't volunteer reassurance. I let the dynamic be seen. That was harder than any confrontation could have been, because silence invites interpretation, and I had spent years controlling how others interpreted me. Now I let go of that control. If people assumed I was fine, I didn't correct them. If they assumed I was distant, I didn't defend myself. What they did with that silence was their responsibility. Behind the scenes, I was making practical adjustments. I updated the documentation at work so responsibilities were clearly defined. I delegated upward when decisions exceeded my role. I began preparing for outcomes, not in fear, but in foresight. If this new version of me caused friction, I wanted to be ready. And it did cause friction, just not immediately. At first, things felt quieter, less smooth. There were longer email threads, more meetings to clarify issues I once resolved alone. Small inefficiencies surfaced. People noticed, but they attributed it to growth, restructuring, and external pressure. No one connected it to me. That anonymity was a strange relief. It allowed me to continue without being pulled back into negotiation, without being asked to explain myself in a language that would minimize what I was doing. Silence protected my resolve. With Lily, the silence stretched. Months now. There were moments I felt the ache of it sharply. Holidays, birthdays, fragments of memories that surfaced without warning. I didn't suppress those feelings. I let them exist without turning them into action. That restraint wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. I had spent too long being the one who reached first, fixed quietly, waited patiently. Moving in silence meant letting the truth of the relationship stand without scaffolding. Whatever came next would be real, or it wouldn't come at all. And that, I realized, was something I could live with. Because for the first time, my silence wasn't costing me myself. It was protecting me. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They don't say, "This is because of you." They just appear as discomfort, confusion, and small fractures in routines that once felt effortless. At first, no one connected them to me. At work, things began to feel heavier. Meetings ran longer. Decisions circled without landing. Projects that used to move cleanly from idea to execution started stalling in the middle, waiting for someone to take ownership. That someone had always been me. But now, without my quiet intervention, the weight had nowhere obvious to go. I noticed it in the language people used. Phrases like, "We'll have to figure this out," and "someone should probably," started replacing the certainty that used to anchor conversations. There was more back and forth, more uncertainty about next steps. Not chaos, just friction. And friction makes people uneasy. Colleagues began checking in more often, not to ask how I was, but to ask if I had seen certain emails, or had thoughts on plans that were already underway. I responded when asked. I answered precisely. I didn't fill in what wasn't requested. That restraint was new to them. I could see it in the slight pause after my replies. In the way some people reread my messages, waiting for the extra sentence that used to come, the one who anticipated their next problem. It didn't. When outcomes weren't as polished, accountability started drifting upward. Managers noticed delays they hadn't noticed before. Not enough to assign blame, but enough to feel the absence of something. Still, no one named it. People rarely want to trace discomfort back to a person they've taken for granted. In my family, the consequences surfaced more quietly and more painfully. I heard it in the way my mother asked about me now. There was a new hesitation in her voice, a sense that she was checking rather than assuming. When she asked if I had spoken to Lily, the question lingered longer than before. "No," I said simply. She didn't press. But the silence after that answer felt different. At a family gathering, Lily and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen for the first time in months. We exchanged small talk, safe, neutral, careful. I didn't reach across the space between us. I didn't fill it with reassurance. She looked tired, more tired than I remembered. For a moment, I saw the impulse rise in her. To say something, to bridge the gap the way she used to. And then it faded. Old habits have gravity. That was the consequence I felt most deeply. Not that she didn't care, but that the distance had become familiar. Later, I heard from my mother that Lily had been struggling more than usual. That she felt overwhelmed. That she didn't know who to lean on. Again, my name wasn't mentioned, and this time, it landed differently. Not as hurt, as confirmation. The world was adjusting to my absence in the ways it always does. By redistributing weight. Some of it went to others. Some of it went nowhere at all. And people began to feel that imbalance. At work, a senior colleague finally asked me, gently, if everything was okay. The question wasn't about my performance, it was about my availability. "I've just been focusing more tightly on my role," I said. Which was true. They nodded, but something shifted behind their eyes. A calculation. A realization that what they had assumed was optional was, in fact, structural. Still, no confrontation came, because confrontation would require acknowledging the dependency. Instead, there was an adjustment, small accommodations, more careful phrasing, slightly more notice given before deadlines. These changes weren't framed as respect, but they were. Respect often arrives disguised as inconvenience. In my personal life, the consequence was a growing quiet around my name. I was no longer the assumed constant. I was a variable now, someone whose presence wasn't guaranteed. That loss of assumption unsettled people. But it didn't unsettle me, because for the first time, I wasn't absorbing the discomfort for everyone else. I was letting it exist where it belonged. Consequences don't punish, they inform. And what they were informing me, slowly, unmistakably, was that my absence had always been doing more work than my presence ever had. There's a moment when people realize something important has changed, but they still believe it can be put back the way it was. That belief is what makes it too late. At work, the first attempts at correction were subtle. I was invited into meetings I hadn't been part of before. Not at the beginning, but near the end. Asked for quick thoughts, given space to comment, but not to reshape. I recognized the pattern immediately. They weren't trying to include me. They were trying to restore what they had lost. When my input didn't produce the same seamless outcomes as before, because it was no longer embedded in the process from the start, there was a flicker of confusion. A sense that something was off, but not quite nameable. One manager suggested kindly that I might be pulling back a bit. I didn't disagree. Instead, I asked what they needed. That question caught them off guard, because they didn't know how to answer it without admitting how much they had relied on me without acknowledging it. So they offered vague reassurances about team balance and support. Nothing concrete. That was the moment I knew the old arrangement couldn't be restored. Not because I wouldn't allow it, but because they couldn't articulate it. In my family, the realization came later. It arrived not as a conversation, but as an urgency. My mother called me one evening, her voice tight with concern. Lily had been having a hard time. More than usual. She hadn't been answering calls. She seemed withdrawn. For a brief second, I felt the old reflex surge, the instinct to step in, to mediate, to be the calm center everyone could lean on. Then I paused. Has she reached out to me? I asked. The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. No, my mother said finally. I just thought you might know what to do. That sentence carried years of assumption. I didn't know what to do. I always had, but knowing doesn't mean intervening. I don't think I'm the person she'd call right now, I said gently. It wasn't an accusation, it was reality. My mother sighed. Not in frustration, with understanding she hadn't allowed herself before. Later, Lily did text me. The message was short, careful, something like, "Hey, sorry I've been distant, things have been a lot." In the past, I would have responded immediately, warmly, reassuringly. I would have closed the distance with a few well-chosen sentences. This time I read it slowly. I responded honestly, but not expansively. I'm sorry you're going through a lot. I'm here if you want to talk. I didn't chase. I didn't fill the silence when she didn't reply. Because fixing it would have meant returning to the pattern where I did the emotional work alone, and that was no longer available. The hardest truth of this phase was accepting that timing matters as much as intention. Care offered too late doesn't heal the original wound. It just soothes the guilt of the person offering it. I wasn't interested in soothing guilt. I was interested in reality. At work, the consequences escalated. Delays became noticeable enough to require explanation. Responsibility had to be reassigned more formally. Processes were revised. None of this was framed as a failure, just as an adjustment to how things are now. I was part of those conversations, but not in the way I once was. I was consulted, not leaned on. Involved, but not embedded. That distinction mattered. People could feel that the old version of me wasn't coming back. And that realization unsettled them. Because once someone stops compensating for a system's blind spots, the system has to either evolve or accept loss. In my family, the loss was quieter. A shared understanding that something precious had been missed, and that it couldn't be recreated on demand. Lily and I weren't estranged, but we weren't what we had been. And no amount of well-timed concern could undo the years of delayed presence. Too late doesn't mean impossible. It means different, and different requires humility from everyone involved, including me. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic reckoning, just truth spoken without urgency. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, in my parents' living room. The kind of afternoon designed to feel safe. Soft light through the curtains, tea cooling on the table, familiar furniture arranged the way it had been for years. Lily sat across from me. She looked older than I remembered, not in appearance, but in posture, like someone who had learned how to carry weight quietly. She was the one who spoke first. "I didn't know how to reach you," she said. Not accusing, Just tired. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood what she meant. I know, I said. And I meant it. She looked surprised by that. People expect defense, explanation, correction. I offered none. I always felt like you were busy with more important things, she continued. And I didn't want to add to that. That sentence landed exactly where it needed to. Not to blame. As a consequence, I didn't rush to reassure her. I didn't say she should have tried harder. I didn't say I would always be there no matter what, because none of that was true in the way it needed to be. I think I taught you that, I said quietly. Not on purpose, but consistently. The room went still. She looked at me for a long moment, as if recalibrating her memory of us. I never thought you didn't care, she said. I just didn't think you'd be available when it mattered. That was the cost of my composure. I let the silence sit. I didn't rush to close it. I was answering emails, I said. The words felt heavy but necessary. When you called that day, I told myself I'd call you back. I didn't realize that was the moment. Her eyes softened, not with anger but with something sadder. I didn't need you to fix anything, she said. I just needed you to answer. There it was, not an indictment, a truth. I know, I said again. And this time my voice didn't protect me. We didn't relitigate every missed moment. We didn't assign fault. There was no tallying of who had failed more. That wasn't the point. The point was acknowledgement. At work, the confrontation came in a different form. A meeting with leadership framed as a check-in. They spoke about shifting responsibilities, about the need for clearer structures, about how my role had evolved. They asked how I felt about it. In the past, I would have minimized. I would have said I was fine, that I'd adjust. This time I chose precision. I'm comfortable with my role, I said, as it is now. Not as it was, as it is now. They nodded. The conversation moved on. No apologies were offered. None were needed. The heat people expect in confrontation often comes from unmet expectations. I no longer had those. With Lily, the conversation didn't fix everything. It didn't restore what we had been, but it did something more sustainable. It reset the terms. I can't promise I'll always be available, I told her. But I can promise I won't make you feel like you're interrupting your own place in my life. She nodded, slowly, as if testing the weight of that promise. We didn't hug dramatically. We didn't cry. We just sat there, letting something settle into a shape that felt honest. Confrontation doesn't have to burn to be effective. Sometimes it just has to be clear. And clarity, I was learning, is the most respectful form of love there is. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was before. But she is heavier, in the sense that she occupies space without apologizing for it. After everything settled, after the conversations ended and the adjustments had become routine, I noticed something unexpected. My life felt slower. Not emptier. Slower. As if I had been living one step ahead of myself for years, and had finally stopped to stand where my body actually was. At work, I am no longer described as easy. I am described as clear. Clear about my scope. Clear about my limits. Clear about when my input is needed and when it isn't. I still do my job well. Better, in some ways, because my attention isn't scattered across invisible obligations. When I speak now, it's earlier in the process, or not at all. That choice has sharpened my voice. Some people adjusted easily. Others didn't. A few drifted away, gravitating toward colleagues who still offered unlimited flexibility. I let them go without resentment. Compatibility isn't a moral issue, it's a structural one. With my family, the changes are quieter and ongoing. Lily and I are not as intertwined as we once were, and we may never be. But what we have now is more honest. When she calls, I answer, or I don't, and I tell her why. When I need something, I ask for it plainly instead of hoping she'll sense it. We no longer rely on assumptions. That has made the relationship less effortless and more real. There are still moments of grief. I won't pretend otherwise. I grieve the version of myself who believed that being indispensable was the same as being loved. I grieve the years when I mistook silence for strength and delay for responsibility. But grief doesn't mean regret defines me. Regret taught me something precise. I learned that being calm doesn't mean being absent. That reliability doesn't require self-erasure. That love offered later can still matter, but it can't replace love offered on time. Most importantly, I learned that quiet dominance isn't about withholding. It's about choosing where your presence actually goes. I no longer rush to fill silence. I let it reveal who is willing to meet me there. I no longer answer everything immediately. I answer what aligns. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. Who I am now is someone who understands that power doesn't announce itself. It accumulates through consistency, boundaries, and the courage to disappoint expectations that were never fair to begin with. I don't perform availability anymore. I practice integrity. And that has changed everything. Not all at once, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once you stop disappearing, you don't have to fight to be seen. You just have to stay. If there's a moral to this story, it isn't always answer the phone. Life is more complicated than that. The moral is quieter and harder to sit with. It's this. The habits you repeat in ordinary moments are the ones people believe in when something extraordinary happens. I didn't miss my sister's call because I didn't love her. I missed it because I had spent years teaching myself and everyone around me that my attention was infinitely postponable. That I would be there eventually. That eventually was enough. It wasn't. I answered emails instead. I regret that every day. Not because emails are evil, or work is wrong, or ambition is something to be ashamed of, but because presence has a timing to it, and some moments don't return in the same form once they've passed. What I've learned since then is that quiet people often carry the greatest responsibility and the least permission. We're praised for being stable, dependable, and low maintenance. And slowly, that praise becomes a cage. People stop checking on us. We stop interrupting. Everyone assumes we're fine. Until one day, the distance is real, and no one knows how it formed. This story isn't an argument for dramatic change or impulsive rebellion. It's an invitation to notice where your silence is coming from. To ask yourself whether it's a choice or a habit you've outgrown. If you're the reliable one, the calm one, the person who always handles it, I want you to hear this clearly. Being needed is not the same as being known, and being strong doesn't require being unreachable. Love doesn't always ask for grand gestures. Sometimes it just asks for your attention on time. Lily and I are still learning how to meet each other without assumptions. Some days are easier than others. What we have now isn't perfect, but it's honest. And honesty, I've learned, is what actually lasts. So I'll leave you with this, not as advice, but as a question worth sitting with. When your phone rings and you tell yourself you'll respond later, what are you really postponing? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever assumed there would be more time? And what did that assumption cost you? Thank you for listening.